Welcome to our deep dive, and today it's all about the cello. We've got a ton of great sources that you sent us all about the cello, and we're going to try to pull out the most interesting stuff from it all and give you the inside scoop on this instrument.
Right.
I've always been fascinated by it. But wow, some of the things we found in your research were really surprising. Like the history is way more interesting than I thought, and the techniques for playing it are pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it really does have a fascinating history. The cello, and it's changed a lot over time. It's evolved in some interesting ways. I think by the end of this, you're going to have a much better understanding of what makes this instrument so unique.
You know, I always thought of the cello as this ancient instrument, but your sources mentioned that it actually got its start in 16th century Italy. That seems surprisingly recent for something that sounds so classic.
Yeah, it's a little newer than you might think, though it did come from some earlier bass instruments. The bass violin and the violin were both popular in the 1500s, and they kind of set the stage for the cello that we know today. The bass violin was basically a giant viola da braccio, like way too big to play under your chin. And the violin had a flat back, not like the cello's curved back. There were both early attempts to bring those really deep bass sounds into orchestras and chamber music.
So they were kind of like the cello's older, less refined siblings. It's funny to think of a giant viola that you can't even tuck under your chin. So your sources go into some detail about how the design of the cello changed over time. Is that something worth getting into?
I think it's worth looking at a few key design elements. Understanding those helps you appreciate how the cello creates its unique sound. Take the end pin, for example. It wasn't added until the mid-18th century, and that was to help support the cello on the floor.
I can see how that would be helpful for the player. I imagine those things can get pretty heavy.
Oh, for sure. And it's not just about comfort for the cellist. That end pin actually plays a big role in the sound projection, too. It allows the cello to vibrate more freely, which gives it that powerful resonance.
So even something as simple as an end pin can have a big impact on the sound. Your sources also talk about the bass bar. What's that all about?
So the bass bar is a brace that runs along the inside of the cello's top. And yeah, it adds structural support, but it also has this really important job in shaping the cello's sound. Think of it as like an internal amplifier. It helps to focus and enhance those low frequencies that give the cello its richness.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the size and weight of the cello itself, the end pin for support and projection, and then the bass bar for amplifying those low tones.
Yeah.
Sounds like a carefully designed system for creating that deep, resonant sound.
Yeah, exactly. Every part of the cello works together to create that unique voice. And speaking of voice, those distinctive F-holes on the front of the cello, those are really important for sound production too.
I've always wondered about those F-holes. They're so elegant, but they also seem kind of mysterious. What they actually do?
They're way more than just decoration. They act as a kind of release valve for the sound waves that are created by the vibrating strings. And they help to project those sound waves outward, which gives the cello its volume and that carrying power.
So if the bass bar is like an internal amplifier, then the F-holes are like the speakers.
That's a great way to think about it. The size and the shape, even the exact placement of the F-holes, all of it has a huge impact on the cello's tone. It's a big part of what gives it its distinctive voice.
I'm starting to realize how much thought and craftsmanship go into creating those beautiful cello sounds.
Yeah.
It's way more complex than I ever imagined. But it's not just about the instrument itself, right? The way it's played also has a big impact on the sound. What are some of the playing techniques that really stand out to you?
Well, there are a lot of fascinating techniques, but a few are really iconic. Glissando, for example, is that beautiful sliding sound that cellists create by smoothly gliding their finger along a string. It's kind of like a vocal slide or a pitch bend on a guitar. It's really expressive and often used for dramatic effect.
I've always loved that sound. It's so smooth and almost haunting. I wonder how they do that without the string getting caught on their finger.
It's all in the skill of a cellist. Years of practice to develop the precise finger pressure and control that's needed for a really smooth glissando. Another technique that creates a very different effect is pizzicato. You've probably heard this one before. It's that sharp percussive sound that comes from plucking the strings with your fingers.
Oh, I've definitely heard that. It gives the music this playful, almost whimsical feel. Is it hard to do?
Pizzicato is actually one of the first things that beginning cellists learn. It's pretty simple to create the sound, but mastering the nuances of timing and dynamics that takes practice. And then there's vibrato, which is a technique that adds so much emotion and depth to the sound.
I've always loved vibrato on string instruments, but I don't really get how it works. Is it just like shaking your finger on the string?
It's a little more nuanced than that. It's a subtle rocking motion of the fingertip on the string, and that creates a slight fluctuation in pitch.
It's like adding a little wave to the sound. It's amazing how much expression can come from such a small movement.
Yeah, it's all about those subtle variations that bring the music to life.
Yeah.
And the cello, with its wide range and its resonant tone, it lends itself beautifully to vibrato. It's one of the things that makes it such an expressive instrument.
I'm starting to understand why the cello is often described as having a voice-like quality.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much more than just playing the notes. It's about bringing those notes to life with all these amazing techniques.
Exactly. And when you combine those techniques with double stops, which is where the cellist plays two notes at the same time, you get even more depth and complexity. It's like adding harmonies and layers to the sound.
Double stops sound interesting. I'd love to hear how those are used in different pieces. But before we get too far down that road, I think we should move on to something I've always found fascinating about the cello. Its versatility. Your sources mention that it shows up in all sorts of music, not just classical.
That's right. The cello's sound and playing techniques translate surprisingly well to all kinds of genres. Yeah, it can go pretty much anywhere musically. While it's definitely a core part of the orchestra, the cello has also found its way into folk jazz, world music, even rock bands.
It's like that friend who just gets along with everybody. What makes the cello so adaptable to all these different styles?
I think it's the combination of its rich, expressive tone and the way it can shift so smoothly between harmonic support and melodic solos. Like it can blend right into the background or take center stage with equal grace.
So it can be the soulful accompanist or the fiery lead singer, depending on the song.
Exactly, and that warm tone works for both melancholic and upbeat melodies. It's just as at home in a somber classical piece as it is in a foot-tapping folk tune.
I'm realizing how much I underestimated the cello. I always liked the sound, but I never realized how much range and personality it has. You mentioned rock bands earlier. Yeah. How does a cello even fit into that kind of high-energy music?
Well, that's where the electric cello comes in. It's amplified so it can keep up with drums and electric guitars. And some rock cellists use looping pedals and effects to create some really unique sounds.
Looping pedals. So they can layer sounds and create these intricate sonic textures. That's pretty cool. Your sources mention that cellos come in different sizes. Is that just for kids, or do adults ever play on smaller instruments?
It's mostly about finding the right fit. Like with any instrument, kids usually start on smaller cellos because a full-size one would just be too big and awkward for them to handle. But even some adults might prefer a smaller size if it fits their body type or their playing style better.
It makes sense that comfort and control would be important. What about strings? Do all cellos use the same kind?
Nope, not at all. There's actually a surprising variety of cello strings out there. Steel core strings are the most common. They're pretty durable and they create a clear, bright sound. And then you've got synthetic core strings made from things like Perlon. Those have a warmer tone. And then there are gut core strings, which are the traditional choice for classical music.
Gut strings sound so old school and almost mythical. What makes them special?
Gut strings have been used for centuries, and they're known for that rich, complex sound that classical musicians really love. They're made from sheep or cow gut that's been specially treated and wrapped in metal.
Wow, that's quite a process.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of work goes into making those strings. Are they hard to maintain?
They do require more care than other types of strings. Gut strings are more sensitive to changes in humidity and temperature, so they can go out of tune more easily. And they're also the most expensive type of string.
So it's a trade-off between sound quality and practicality. It makes sense why steel strings are so popular. They seem like a good all-around choice. But no matter what kind of strings you use, your sources really stress the importance of taking good care of your cello.
Oh, definitely. Cellos are beautiful instruments, but they're also pretty delicate. They're made of wood, which means they're really sensitive to changes in humidity. Ideally, you want to keep a cello in an environment with a relative humidity of 40 to 60%.
So too dry or too humid is bad news for a cello. What happens if the humidity levels are off?
Well, if the air's too dry, the wood can shrink and crack. And if it's too humid, the wood can swell, and that can cause warping or even damage to the glue joints.
It sounds like Goldilocks. You got to find that just right humidity level to keep the cello happy. How do cellists manage that, especially when they're traveling or living in places with really extreme temperatures?
There are a few tricks. Many cellists use these special humidifiers that are made for instruments. They go inside of the case to help regulate the moisture levels around the cello.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of cases, is there a specific way a cello should be stored when it's not being played?
Yeah, it's important to always keep a cello in its protective hard case when you're not using it. And like we talked about, keeping that ideal humidity level inside the case is key. You also want to avoid exposing the cello to direct sunlight or extreme heat, because those can damage the wood too.
It sounds like owning a cello is kind of like having a delicate pet. You have to be mindful of its needs and create a stable, nurturing environment for it.
That's a great analogy, but just like a cherished companion, a well-cared-for cello can give you years of musical joy.
Speaking of musical joy, let's talk about the cello's role in different musical settings. It's obviously a big deal in orchestras, but your sources mention that it also shines in chamber music and even some unexpected genres.
Yeah, that's right. The cello's versatility really shows up in its ability to blend into all sorts of musical settings. Like in an orchestra, the cello section usually provides harmonic support, often doubling the bass lines an octave higher.
So it adds depth and richness to the overall sound of the orchestra. But does the cello ever get a chance to show off its solo skills in an orchestral setting?
Oh, definitely. While the cello section often has a supporting role, there are tons of times where a cello gets to take center stage as a melodic soloist. Lots of famous composers have written beautiful and challenging cello concertos that really showcase the instrument's lyrical and expressive side.
I bet those concertos are incredible to hear live. The cello sound just soaring above the whole orchestra. What about chamber music? How does the cello fit into those smaller groups?
Chamber music is all about the interplay and balance between the individual instruments, and the cello plays a crucial role in that dynamic. In a string quartet, for example, the cello often provides both harmonic support and melodic counterpoint to the violins and viola.
So it's like a bridge between the higher and lower voices, adding depth and texture to the overall sound.
Exactly. The cello helps to blend the sounds of the other instruments and create a really cohesive and balanced ensemble. And like we mentioned before, the cello isn't just limited to the world of classical music. It's made its way into folk, jazz, world music, even pop.
I'm really starting to get why the cello is considered such a versatile instrument. It can hold its own in a massive orchestra or blend seamlessly into a small group, and it's comfortable playing everything from Bach to bluegrass.
It's true. The cello's range is incredible, and I think that's a big part of what makes it so appealing.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've explored the cello's history, construction, those unique playing techniques, and its versatility across musical genres. I feel like I have a way deeper appreciation for this instrument now. But let's say someone is really inspired by all this and wants to start learning the cello. What advice would you give them?
Learning any instrument takes a lot of dedication, but the cello is so rewarding. It's worth it. The first thing I would say is find a good teacher, someone who can really guide you through the basics, like posture and technique, all those fundamental things.
Yeah, finding a good teacher is always key, no matter what you're learning. And you mentioned before that choosing the right cello is important too, especially for beginners.
Absolutely. We talked about how cellos come in different sizes, and yeah, starting with the right size is so important. It's about comfort, and it helps prevent injuries. A good teacher can help you figure out what size is best for you, for your body, and your playing style.
So finding that teacher who can help you with all that is a good place to start. What about the instrument itself? Are all beginner cellos basically the same?
Well, there's definitely a range of quality out there. Just like with any other instrument, beginner cellos are usually made with less expensive materials and simpler construction, which makes sense when you're just starting.
It's like you don't need a professional chef's knife when you're just learning how to chop veggies. You just want something that works and helps you learn the basics.
Exactly. And as you get better and your ear develops, you might start to notice the limits of a beginner cello. And that's usually a sign that it's time to upgrade, to get an instrument with a richer sound and that's more responsive.
So it's kind of like leveling up. You start with the basic model, and then as your skills get better, you invest in better equipment that can take you to that next level.
I like that analogy. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of beginners choose to rent a cello at first. That gives them the flexibility to upgrade as they improve without having to spend a ton of money up front.
That makes a lot of sense. It takes the pressure off of having to commit to a specific instrument before you really know if you're going to stick with it.
What about the bow? Is that something you have to think about separately, or does it usually come with the cello?
Some beginner cellos are sold as outfits, and those include the cello, a bow, and a case. But it's often worth it to get a slightly better bow than the one that comes in those outfits. A good bow can make a big difference in the sound and in how the instrument feels to play.
So the bow is kind of like the artist's brush. It's the tool that brings out all the cello's expressive potential.
That's a great way to put it. The bow really does play a crucial role in shaping the cello's sound, and it's definitely something to pay attention to. I'm realizing there's so much more to the cello than I ever thought. Like, it goes so much deeper than what you see and hear. It's been amazing to learn about all this, from the history and how it's built to the techniques, and even how to take care of it.
It's been fun to explore all this with you. The cello really is a captivating instrument, and I hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for its complexity and beauty.
Oh, it definitely has. I
Has
feel like I've
that-
gotten a whole new understanding of the cello. And who knows, maybe someone listening right now will be inspired to pick one up and start their own musical journey.
That would be great. And for those who already love the cello, I hope this has given you some new insights and maybe even inspired you to check out different styles of cello music or try out some new techniques.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the cello.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time, keep those cello strings vibrating.